This is the grandest financial experiment humanity has ever run, and most people barely realize they are participants. Global debt sovereign, corporate, household, financial, has ballooned to records no civilization has borne. Governments borrow trillions as if it were trivial. Central banks summon currency with keystrokes. Families sign 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. And still, we speak as though debt were normal, harmless, permanent. The unsettling truth is older than money, debt. To understand how we arrived here, go back to debt's roots. Debt is as old as recorded life. The first clay tablets of Mesopotamia were not poetry or metaphysics. They were ledgers, grain tallies, cattle counts, obligations noted under temple authority. In early societies, debt was sacred. Priests and kings adjudicated balances, enforced collections, and at intervals proclaimed sweeping jubilees that wiped slates clean to prevent collapse. Imagine that. A society that knew survival demanded periodic reset, leaped to the Renaissance when houses like the Medici professionalized credit. Debt evolved from grain and metal to paper claims and bookkeeping entries. Popes and princes borrowed to fight wars, build cathedrals, and expand empires. Yet every ledger carried risk. Spain, drenched in New World silver, still defaulted repeatedly in the 16th century because the crown's ambition outran revenues. Lesson 1. Even treasure-rich empires drown when leverage outruns reality. Debt ceased to be merely personal. The modern explosion began in the 20th century. After World War I, nations staggered under sums that seemed unrecoverable. Germany was shackled by reparations under Versailles obligations, so punishing that contemporary economists warned of turmoil. By the way, if you love money, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Now, let's continue. They were right. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s. Wheelbarrows of paper marks for bread arose from promises that could not be met in real terms. The trauma scarred politics and helped pave the road to a second, darker war. Debt was not an accounting foot. Then came Bretton Woods in 1944, the blueprint for the post-war order. The United States, sitting on most of the world's gold, set the anchor, the dollar convertible into gold at 35 an ounce. Other currencies pegged to the dollar. The aspiration was stability. The result was dependence. Every bond, budget, and balance sheet came to rest on the promise of American discipline. For a while, the promise held. Temptation never left. By the late 1960s, with the Vietnam War and ambitious domestic programs, Washington issued more dollars than it had gold. Foreign governments noticed and demanded metal for paper. In 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar floated. Debt floated with it. Now, governments could borrow and print at will, limited only by confidence. That break in 1971 was a quiet revolution. Debt transformed from finite to elastic. Unshackled from gold, central banks learned to steer economies by moving interest rates. When growth slowed, lower rates encouraged borrowing. When crisis hit, policymakers created still more credit to patch the hole. Each rescue required more leverage than the last. The 1980s saw vast expansions of public debt under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, defended as necessary for defense and reform. The crisis of 2008 was not only about housing, it was about a tower of leveraged debt layered upon debt so high that when one corner crumbled, the edifice shook. Mortgages were bundled into securities, sold worldwide, insured with derivatives, and amplified with 30-to-1 leverage. When it broke, banks vanished, pensions shrank, and governments rushed in with multi-trillion-dollar rescues. The cruel irony. Institutions that borrowed recklessly were saved, while ordinary people absorbed unemployment. Since then, the figures turned surreal. In 2 decades, global debt roughly tripled, cresting above $300 trillion by 2023, nearly 4 times world output. Governments, firms, and households piled on. Some countries, like Japan, now carry public debts exceeding 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions yearly with little debate. Emerging markets borrow in foreign currency, courting disaster when rates rise and the dollar strengthens. Stability now depends on an illusion, that lev. But debt always collects a price. It distorts behavior, inflates bubbles, shifts wealth, and mortgages the future. Every borrowed dollar is a claim on tomorrow's work. When the sums swell past reason, honest repayment becomes fantasy. That is why history is crowded with restructurings, inflations, and defaults. Debts end in three ways. You pay them, you debase them, or you refuse them. No empire, no system escapes that arithmetic. The present consequences are everywhere, disguised by routine. When your government runs a deficit, it does not knock at your door. It issues bonds, sells them to banks and foreign funds, and quietly builds a tab in your name. When you swipe a card, you are borrowing, not paying. When corporations boast record profits, the numbers often ride on borrowed cash used for buybacks. The system thrives on leverage. Leverage is like gravity, weightless on the way up, crushing on the way down. Today's finance, ECF. Consider the United States, anchor of the system. Federal debt pushed past $34 trillion in 2024. The figure is so vast it turns abstract. Translate it. Per taxpayer, obligations stack into the hundreds of thousands. Interest outlays now rival defense spending. The superpower borrows simply to service prior borrowing. Europe rhymes. Debt to GDP ratios linger above 100% in places like Italy and Greece. China's buildup hides in local financing vehicles and state firms, shadow liability. The trap is psychological as much as financial. Politicians prefer borrowing because it buys time. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers more. Debt seems painless. Future citizens will handle it. The illusion works until rates rise. That is exactly what began in 2022, when central banks tightened to fight inflation. Servicing costs surged. Governments squeezed budgets. Households saw mortgage payments leap. Firms confronted expensive refinancings. Debt is a sleeping predator, harmless while. Even as risks grow, debt keeps being marketed as a path to prosperity. Students are told to load up on loans for degrees that may or may not pay. Families are urged to stretch for homes near the edge of affordability because real estate always goes up. Nations hear that deficits don't matter because central banks can print. That is the grand lie of modern finance. Debt is free, infinite, safe. History shouts the opposite. What comes next is predictable if you study the past. When obligations outrun reason, only a few exits remain. One is inflation, quietly shrinking the real value of what's owed by debasing currency. It is already present. If prices jump by 10%, your savings lose 10% of power, but your government's burden shrinks by the same margin. Inflation functions as a hidden tax and is politically easier than default. The second exit is restructuring admitting debts cannot be paid and renegotiating the... So, which road will leaders choose? The signs point toward inflation as the preferred route. Central banks can speak like hawks, but debt-heavy states require erosion of real value to cope. That means ordinary citizens bear the cost. Wages, savings, and future purchasing power are drained to keep the structure intact. People tolerate it because inflation creeps. The numbers are abstract, and the system trains us to think debt is someone else's problem. Here is the final lens. Debt is about power. Who lends, who borrows, who is rescued when the music stops. The architecture ensures that when burdens grow unbearable, the powerful seldom pay. Banks are bailed out. Corporations restructure. Politicians retire. Ordinary people lose homes, jobs, and years that cannot be reclaimed. Understanding debt is not optional literacy. It is survival. If you cannot see the trap, you will live inside it, chained by promises you did not make. What should you do? First, strip away illusions. Debt is not neutral. Every borrowed dollar carries consequence. Second, recognize the pattern. No empire, nation, or system has dodged a reckoning. Timelines vary, destinations rhyme. Third, protect yourself. Not by panic or burying gold, but by building resilient wealth assets less dependent on someone else's promise, paired with skills that compound through cycles. Keep perspective so recycled tricks do not hook you again. The system will try, because the cycle repeats. Debt grows, leaders deny, crises erupt, societies reset. Your choice is to move through it, blind or awake. If you see the snares, you can step around them. If you don't, you will pay for mistakes you never made. Global debt is not merely a spreadsheet entry. It is the shadow across tomorrow. If this gave you a new lens, subscribe. History holds answers, and this channel shows where to look. See the machine clearly. Low rates are grease. Collateral is the belt. Confidence is the sea. This is not a call for despair. It is a call for clarity and agency. Hold some claims that are not another party's liability. Keep a margin of safety. Beware the siren of easy credit that trades tomorrow's freedom for today's convenience. Reward leaders who tell fiscal truths over fairy tales. Teach compounding on savings and on debts to every child. None of this will stop the cycle, but it will change your position within it. In a world built on leverage, margin is freedom. Yes, this is the grandest FINA. Build a realistic map of how debt cycles work. Credit booms begin with optimism, strong collateral values, easy terms, and a story that justifies stretch. As prices rise, lenders relax covenants, borrowers extrapolate, and policymakers congratulate themselves. Risk migrates, from balance sheets to off-balance vehicles, from banks to funds, from public ledgers to quasi-public entities. Maturity gets shorter, while duration risk grows. Liquidity seems deep until it is not. Then, a spark-missed coup. For households, the antidote is prudence. Budget with buffers, fix rates when feasible, shun unnecessary variable obligations, ladder liquidity, and diversify income. For savers, pair productive risk with ballast equity with cash flow, bonds with quality, real assets with patience. For entrepreneurs, favor cash generation over cosmetic optics. Debt that pays for itself can be tool. Debt that flatters optics becomes trap. For citizens, insist on transparent budgets, sunset clauses, and independ. Consider historical echoes beyond the famous cases. The long depression of the 1870s followed a railroad credit mania whose collapse cascaded through banks and trade. The Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s exposed the danger of foreign currency liabilities that balloon when domestic currencies break. The Eurozone drama after 2010 illustrated the trap of sharing a currency without sharing a fiscal authority. In every instance, the surface narrative differed, while the substructure rhymed. Technology does not repeal these cycles. It often accelerates them. High-frequency communications transmit panic instantly. Complex instruments distribute exposures so widely that nobody quite knows who bears what, which freezes trust at the worst moment. Meanwhile, social media amplifies both complacency and fear. Narratives move capital. When the story turns, cash runs faster than regulators can draft memos. None of this implies retreat from modernity. The project is to align innovation with resilience, finance that supports productive investment, households that can absorb variance, states that practice discipline when the sun is shining, so they have space to act when storms arrive, a culture that praises steady builders over flashy alchemists, accountability up and down the stack. Ultimately, the question is civic as much as financial. Do we prefer hard truths with smaller headaches now, or soothing illusions that culminate in larger crises later? History suggests that societies get the crises they tolerate. Choose better. Start small, start local, and compound improvements. The arithmetic that dooms reckless systems can also reward patient ones. Tilt the odds by acting before you must. If you made it this far, drop a plus in the comments your badge for finishing the deep dive. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form stories where money, history, and power collide. Curious about earlier empires of capital? Check out our others video.